Welcome Internet, the psychologist's casual review, and today we're going to be reviewing something that's kind of outside of the ordinary, namely a book that's not about fairy, but it is about life events, notably events that happen in the psychoanalytic community. So the book is called In the Freud Archives, and it's written by Janet Malcolm, a journalist, she's not a psychoanalyst nor a psychologist, so her perspective is kind of fresh on the whole ordeal. So what is this book about? Well, basically this book is about humans and their relationships. And I found that very, very interesting because it takes a common setting, which is psychoanalysis, something that I'm very passionate about, and kind of shows you how things develop. Notably, the relationship of two men, Jeffrey Mason and Kurt Hessler. So both of them were psychoanalysts. However, Kurt Hessler was one of the very first psychoanalysts. He knew Freud and Anna Freud personally. So I don't know if he knew Freud well, but from my understanding, they at least knew themselves from a distance. So he's one of the, let's say, very first generation psychoanalysts, people that have now unfortunately all passed away. So in a way it was very interesting to see that he was in charge of the Freud archives, meaning all the documents that Freud wrote were kind of collected, and basically he was in charge of that, which was a very important job. And he was basically in pourparlers, as the French would say, meaning in constant discussion with Anna Freud, Freud's daughter. So basically, he was at a very high position, and comes in what would become, unfortunately for him and for the community, his successor, Jeffrey Mason, which is presented as a very charismatic and incredibly sharp individual intellectually, which you do see throughout the book. He's he charms his way through the community. As Janet points out at the very beginning, basically psychoanalytic community and the psychoanalysis can be very, very guarded people, very, very austere, very, very orthodox in their way of being. And Jeffrey was none of that. Mr. Mason, because he's still alive, is very, very warm in his contact and very, very charismatic. So in the relationship develops a bond in between Hessler and Jeffrey. And the whole problem is that basically Mason, who met Anna Freud, who basically had a lot of power in the analytic community, at some point decided that he needed the truth, or at least what he perceived as the truth, to come out, which he did by publishing a book called The Assault on Truth. And basically, it was a whole book to discredit psychoanalysis at its foundations, because basically, through the archives, Jeffrey Mason tried to throw shade on the whole psychoanalytic community, every single therapist. And he told that quite frankly to Janet Malcolm, that basically his whole goal was to basically destroy psychotherapy, which is ambitious, let's say. And basically his whole point was, because he had arguments that basically Freud denied trauma, and that basically therefore all psychotherapists have denied trauma, and that basically psychotherapy is just bullshit. That's, in essence, very badly explained, but that's what he felt. And he was particularly dangerous in the fact that, first and foremost, he completely dismissed everyone who came after Freud and that changed the theory. He just focused on Freud and thinking that that was like the baseline. As I've talked about it, basically he made the same mistake and assumption that things haven't gone forward since Freud. But what I found very interesting is basically how he was able to fascinate other people to get his way and basically be able to corrupt the whole system. And that, I think, is the most interesting part of the book. How a man that basically was a Sanskrit professor just top traits and through just pure sheer charisma was able to manipulate his way into such a guarded profession. And that is for me something that is a real takeaway from this book, is that basically one should always be very conscious of fascination, because it seems to me that the more you're fascinated, the worse it is. It lowers your defenses, your thinking, your critical thinking about the other, and you start allowing them to do things you wouldn't allow anyone else. And that's exactly what happened to Hessler. Such a brilliant psychoanalysis, because he was like top of the top of psychoanalysis. He was like, nowadays it would be basically someone like Ilom or Otto Kernberg that would have that level of notoriety. And he basically just fell into, I wouldn't say the trap, because I don't think Mason planned to destroy psychoanalysis. It just so happened that I think at some point he felt that enough was enough and that the truth had to be known. And he does have some arguments that Freud basically, he himself, Freud, wanted his theory to be purely inner subjective, meaning that the true trauma was not Freud's point. He tossed it aside, saying, well, basically that's unimportant. And that's a valid criticism. However, analysts after Freud have debunked that, have come forward to say, no, we have to take into trauma, the real place of trauma within our psyche. So, I mean, it's quite disingenuous to just focus on Freud. The other thing is that very quickly throughout the book, you kind of feel that Jeffrey Mason, at least how it's presented by Janet Malcolm, is a bad faith actor, meaning that basically he just tries to twist things to get his way. And the more the book develops, the more that takes credence and importance, to the point where he even took to court Janet Malcolm, which was a nasty move. At least that's how I felt reading the book. That was kind of really a nasty move. And he lost a court case. So, I mean, yes, that's something that happened. He lost a court case, and basically he was shown his own words. He even said that he was an intellectual gigolo. And that's a quote, right? It's not invented. And basically, he seems to be a very, very manipulative human. At least how it's presented in the book. Of course, I haven't met the guy, so don't know. But anyway, the other thing that I found very interesting was that there's a Freud scholar that's kind of a self-taught expert on Freud, but only on Freud and the life of Freud, not the rest. And like, he's not really interested in psychoanalysis, but in Freud. And he was able to like investigate and guess who were the patients of Freud, but like on stuff like hotels and who stayed where, when, and how Freud got out of his daily life. I mean, incredible stuff, like real detective investigation work. So his name is Peter Swells. And he was really, really an interesting character. He's a real person, of course, like everyone. And basically, he's just impressive, really. I mean, to be able to deduce things. And he even got in touch with, like, the daughter of a colleague of Freud called Fliss. I mean, incredible. Like, just like movie stuff that you'd see there. But it's true. It's reality. And it's the whole ordeal that he was unfortunately insulted by Hessler. Hessler called him a schizophrenic and a paranoid. And because basically he also was trying to show that Freud was not that much of a great scholar or a great professor, that basically he was a cocaine addict. And which is true, I mean, there's nothing wrong about saying that. But he also wanted to attack Freud. So there was a kind of crossing of both wanted to attack each other, and they kind of like, it got so bad that it was like some kind of Mexican standoff for psychoanalysis, and one of the most massive controversies that came out of it. And I think that this book was incredibly important also because basically it shows you how if you put people in individuals, however good they might be, in positions of power, like was Hessler with the Freud archives, basically they can still be manipulated, they can still be deceived. And that's very important, because I think that most people feel that because you're a psychologist, a psychotherapist, a psychoanalyst, you're beyond being deceived. But that's not true. It's not true, because basically we still remain very human, very flawed. And people like Mason do pick up on the flaws, do show us a version of themselves that's great, wonderful, and that kind of makes our defenses fall asleep. And basically, it's true for everyone, and Hessler is no exception, even though he was one of the pioneers of psychoanalysis within the group of Freud, like one of the first generations, and he was still had in a way that seems incredible. And I think that that's a stark reminder that basically everyone's flawed, and that it isn't about knowledge, it's about emotion and experience. Like, you can have all the knowledge in the world of all the mental illnesses, of how to treat them, how to deal with them. You're still at the end of the day vulnerable to your own a prioris, beliefs, or even needs, or envy in the fact of something you want. And that's the whole point of the book, that basically Hessler was in a way seduced by an image of Mason, and was able to basically give the keys to a man that just wrecked the whole apartment in a way, or tried to wreck it. And the aftermath of which I think psychoanalysis has recovered, because basically, well, Mason hurt it, yes, but he didn't destroy it. It's still good and lively. And I think that's because basically you can't destroy something of an institution by yourself, regardless of how much you think you can. And that's also the whole point of the book, is that even though there's destructive tendencies, sometimes doesn't mean that that breaks everything down. And that doesn't mean that things don't survive. And I think that that's a nice and interesting message, even if things kind of are hurt. But on the flip side is that basically both of them continued their lives. Hessler, I think, died in the late 90s, so he remained a bit scarred from all this experience. And Mason became a specialist in animal behavior, of all things, and how animals are kinder than humans. So clearly he was kind of done with mankind as a topic. So basically it was a very interesting book, a very worthwhile book. I know that people that have been involved with the book are still alive, so now they're quite old. I mean, they would be in their 80s, 90s. So basically it's still something that might pop up in the future, maybe as a memoir or something of the ilk, but I don't think so. Anyway, it was a very interesting read, and I would recommend it just for you to get how manipulation works and how manipulation tactics can influence even the best of us. So I hope you're interested, and please feel free to leave a comment. See you next time. Bye.